This is The History of Bilingual Education Policies and Cases by Jada Johnson. Starting off, we're going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which was a court dispute about racial segregation in schools. So this court case took place May 17th, 1954. And at the end of the whole dispute, the court ruled that racial segregation violates the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and rights to African Americans. And they also said that schools must provide equal education to all students. So, although this case had nothing to do with bilingual education or English learning students, the idea that all students deserve an equal education did help ELLs in their venture to rights. Next up, we have the National Defense Education Act, which was passed September 2nd, 1958. This act was passed in response to Russia's launch of Sputnik. So, after this defeat by Russia, the government wanted to improve American schools and American students, regardless of who they were. So, this act helped ELLs because it included funding for bilingual education, which battled the English only mentality of Americans. So, like I mentioned earlier, the government wanted to improve every single American student, regardless of where they came from, what language they spoke. So, they wanted to help ELLs develop their English speaking skills so they could become better Americans. The next policy should look a little bit familiar because we did just go over it in our last DJA. So, this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed July 2nd, 1964. This policy prohibits discrimination by any federally funded program or activity. So, for example, or in this case, they're talking about a public school. Similarly to Brown versus Board of Education, this act helped ELLs find their footing when it came to gaining rights for themselves. So, although it had nothing to do with bilingual education or ELLs, it really helped them a lot when it came to gaining rights for themselves. So, for example, it was used to form an argument for the Lau versus Nichols case that ultimately helped them win the case, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next, we have the Bilingual Education Act, which was the first and strongest form of bilingual education. This act was passed January 2nd, 1968. And with this act, the federal government provided financial assistance for the education of ELLs in both their native language and in English. And because this act sought to increase English skills and support native languages, ELL students greatly benefited, and this really shined a spotlight on bilingualism and not just increasing the proficiency of the students' English skills. It actually focused on maintaining both of those languages. The next court case we're going to talk about is Cerna versus Portales Municipal Schools. This court case took place on July 17th, 1974. So basically, this was a dispute about unequal educational opportunities. The court ruled that students with Spanish surnames achieved less than students with non-Spanish surnames. So, for example, a student with the last name Gonzalez was usually doing worse than a student with the last name Anderson. The Portales Municipal School District was made, or they had to implement a bilingual or a bicultural education program. So this court case and this court ruling shine the light on the achievement gap between Hispanic and non-Hispanic students, and it really motivated the government to address the situation. So this helps ELLs a lot because the government now sees how much they're struggling and how much help and resources they need to be on an equal playing field as other students. So they receive those resources and that help. This is the court case that I mentioned previously in the presentation, Lau versus Nichols. This court case took place January 1st, 1974. And the whole basis of this court case was that schools were giving Chinese-speaking students English-only materials and instruction, trying to keep the playing field equal for everyone. But the court ruled that placing students in the same school with the same material is not the same as providing students with an equal education. They found that this education was basically meaningless because these students did not understand what they were learning. They also ruled that ELL should be provided classes in their native tongue. This really helped ELLs because it resulted in the Lau remedies, which are policy guidelines for the education of ELLs based on the case rulings. Now we're moving on to the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which was passed August 21st, 1974. This act provided equal educational services to everyone, and it also mentions that appropriate actions must be taken to enforce the EEOA if necessary. So the government saw bilingual education as one of these actions to take in order to make educational opportunities equal. And this really helped ELLs by creating a reason for schools to be attentive to their needs. Because the president wanted to see everyone being equal, every student being equal, schools really had to be up to those standards. And so it gave them a reason to provide for their ELLs and to do the best they can for their ELLs. The last court case we're going to be talking about in this presentation is Castaneda versus Pickard, which took place August 17th, 1981. This was a dispute over students not receiving an effective or efficient bilingual education. So basically, they would be in bilingual education, but the program wouldn't be helping them as much as it needed to. As a result of this, the court ruled that the school needed to establish a three-part test to determine if school districts are complying with the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. So the first part being theory. They had to be backed by a legitimate educational theory. They had to be using that as a base for their program development. The second part is practice. So they had to put their program into place with appropriate personnel and resources for the students. And the last step is results. So if they saw that the program was failing to produce positive results, they had to stop the program and basically start from the ground up and find another theory, put it back into practice, and test the results again. So this court case really helped to ensure that ELLs were getting a quality education when it came to bilingual education, and they weren't just sitting in another room being taught in their native tongue and not developing their English skills at all. The next policy we're going to talk about is the No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed September 2001. This policy really held schools accountable for the success of their ELL students. They did this by basically taking a portion of the school's government funding, waving it in front of their face, and saying, if you do not help these students and if they are not succeeding, then you will not receive this money. And of course, when we start talking about money, people are going to be motivated to do better. So this really helped ELLs because schools were given a motive to help them succeed in their English and content skills. They were being held accountable for their actions. So of course, like anyone who could help these students succeed would be placed in these students' lives at this point. So of course, ELLs were put as a priority after this act was passed. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed December 10th, 2015, so really recently. And this is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This policy shifts the way that schools identify, serve, test, and report ELLs. And I'm going to go into detail about each one of these. So when I say identify, it means that the states have to create a uniform process. So formerly, each school was responsible for creating a way to identify their own students, but now the whole state is responsible for coming up with a process. Serve. So just like I mentioned before with the No Child Left Behind Act, the schools were given an incentive for serving these students better. So they were given their portion of funding. However, if they did not do that, if they did not serve these students the way that they needed to, that portion of funding would be taken away from them. Test is they do not count their pass rates, or they don't count the pass rates of newly arrived immigrants because of their very poor English speaking skills. They give them a few years to start developing their understanding of the language before they're able to count their pass rate. And by report, I mean that they now have to report long-term students, so students who stay in a bilingual education program for, I think it was over 5 years. They now need to report those students so someone can address that situation and see if it's from poor education or if it's from a lack of understanding somewhere along the line. This really helped ELLs because it put them as even more of a priority in the government and in the schools, because now they have people helping from all different directions. They have people helping with a bunch of different aspects. So it's basically putting them equal to every other student and giving them the same attention as their peers.